The clinking of my fork against the ceramic plate was a lonely sound. I was sitting at a restaurant with my son, Michael, and his wife, Ashley, but I felt completely alone. Michael was fixated on his phone, scrolling through it for the third time since we had sat down, while Ashley picked at her chicken sandwich and glanced around with a critical eye, as if the entire place was a personal offense. I placed my coffee cup on the table, trying to get their attention, and asked about their finances. I mentioned the check I'd given him just 2 days ago, hoping it had helped him with everything. Michael barely looked up from his phone, giving a quick and dismissive, "Yeah, Dad. Thanks for that." He mentioned the $50,000, a casual observation of an amount that represented so much to me. It had come from months of careful budgeting, the sale of my late wife's jewelry, and even a withdrawal from my emergency fund. I had done it because I couldn't bear to see him burdened by the constant calls from debt collectors. Hoping to connect with them, I suggested we could take a trip together, a nice vacation. It had been years since we traveled as a family. Ashley let out a sharp laugh. I was told my idea was sweet, but that they were already planning their own vacation. When I asked where they were going and mentioned I might be able to join, Michael interrupted me. He stated that a ticket to Hawaii cost $1,400, and if I couldn't afford it, I should simply stay behind. His words felt like a physical blow. I sat there in silence, staring at the man I had raised, supported through college, and helped through every crisis. All around us, other families were laughing, but our table was now completely quiet except for the scraping of Ashley's knife on her plate. She added that they had earned this 2-week vacation in Maui and had no intention of dragging along elderly people who would just complain about everything. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for my water glass. Elderly people. I was only 65, not 90. Just 48 hours prior, I had given them $50,000, and now they were discussing their luxury vacation as if I were a burden asking for a handout. I quietly acknowledged what they had said. Michael was already back on his phone, showing Ashley something on the screen. They whispered and giggled like teenagers getting ready to cause trouble. The money I had sacrificed, the check I had written, was already being mentally converted into new clothes and expensive resort suites. Without another word, I left $40 on the table, which was more than enough to cover our meal and a generous tip. Neither of them looked up as I walked away. In the car, I gripped the steering wheel, the radio playing a cheerful pop song about summer adventures. Through the restaurant window, I could see them still at the table, now animated, likely planning how to spend the rest of my money. The number Michael had said, $1,400, was so specific. He had already done the research. I can only imagine the scene back at their apartment. Ashley would have kicked off her expensive heels the moment they entered, and Michael would have immediately sat on the couch with his laptop. I'm sure Ashley's first thought was how dramatic I was and that I would get over it. Everything in their apartment showed their priorities, a giant television on one wall and overdue bills cluttering the kitchen counter. I could picture them scrolling through pictures of luxury suites at some fancy resort, with ocean views and private balconies for over $2,000 a night. I'm sure Ashley was right there with him, already looking for designer swimwear. The $37,000 in credit card debt they had mentioned to me must have felt abstract as they were surrounded by all of their expensive possessions. I imagine Michael would have triumphantly announced his booking of a premium ocean suite with spa packages. Ashley, already adding items to her online shopping cart, would have asked about the total cost. I can picture them discussing their spending, with the rest of the money going to clothes, activities, and a comfortable cushion for shopping and dining. I imagine Ashley making a joke about how I could have ever thought I could afford Hawaii on my small pension. I know Michael would have laughed with her. He never once thought about where the $50,000 had come from. He probably just thought I had seen a travel brochure and wanted to tag along. He certainly never considered that I had sacrificed my own belongings and memories to help him. I imagine he thought that $1,400 was nothing compared to the $10,000 they were planning on spending. As the sun went down, their coffee table probably became their command center for their vacation, with confirmations, restaurant reservations, and activity bookings spread everywhere. They likely had every detail planned to get the most likes and comments on social media. I'm certain neither of them even mentioned me again. I had served my purpose, provided the funds, and now I could just fade into the background. As they ended their night, their father's hurt feelings must have seemed as distant and unimportant as my humble house across town. The following morning, I sat at my wooden desk, the morning light filtering through the curtains. I held a photograph of my wife, Margaret, my hands trembling slightly. My coffee had grown cold an hour ago, as I hadn't been able to sleep after yesterday's revelation about my son. Margaret's smile looked back at me from the silver frame. The picture was from our anniversary dinner, just months before her cancer diagnosis. I remembered the blue dress she wore, her eyes bright with all the plans for retirement that we would never get to take. The oncologist's words echoed in my mind, stage 4, perhaps 6 months with aggressive treatment. We had sold our beautiful house in La Jolla in just 3 weeks to pay for experimental treatments not covered by insurance. $150,000 in equity was gone in a desperate attempt to buy time with her. Margaret never once complained about having to move to a smaller place or mentioned any of the sacrifices she had to make. "Take care of Michael," she had whispered during her final days. "He'll need guidance without me." I had taken that promise to heart, helping him through his extended college years when he changed majors twice and failed a statistics course. I had given him emergency loans for his first and last month's rent when he couldn't manage his entry-level salary and helped with car payments when his credit couldn't get him a decent rate. When he met Ashley, everything changed. My small acts of generosity suddenly became expectations. I had quietly paid for his wedding, including the $12,000 for flowers and photography, which he had casually mentioned that someone was covering. Ashley's influence on my son was both immediate and toxic. He used to call twice a week, but after he married Ashley, our conversations felt like business transactions. What hurt the most was how their tone grew colder with each request. I remembered Ashley's eye rolls during family dinners and their hushed conversations that immediately stopped when I entered the room. The $50,000, which I had scraped together by selling Margaret's engagement ring and her grandmother's pearls, was handed over without any appreciation, the same way you would give a waiter a tip. I placed Margaret's photo back on the desk and opened my old address book. The worn leather cover was filled with contacts from my banking career. Thomas, a former junior analyst of mine, had worked his way up to senior vice president. He was a good man who understood discretion. I knew if anyone could help me regain a sense of dignity, it would be him. As I held the receiver, I was reminded that Margaret's values about family and personal dignity had not disappeared with her death. It was time for Michael to learn that his father, while elderly, was still a force to be reckoned with. Thomas answered the phone on the second ring. I explained that I had a banking matter that required discretion and needed to place a stop payment on a personal check for $50,000. Thomas didn't ask any unnecessary questions, which was a quality I had always appreciated. He just asked for the name of the recipient and my account verification. I quietly told him that it was my son, Michael, and that the stop payment needed to be put in place immediately, before he tried to deposit the check. Thomas assured me that it would be handled and that the order would be in their system within the hour. After I had provided the necessary details, Thomas kindly added that the stop payment fee would be waived as a professional courtesy. As he quietly wished me well with my family's situation, I thanked him for his discretion. The call ended just before 11:30 a.m. I knew that by 2 p.m. Michael would realize that his plans were falling apart. I spent the afternoon organizing my paperwork and finances, preparing for the inevitable phone call. At 3:15 p.m., my phone rang. Michael's voice cracked with panic as he demanded to know what I had done. He said the bank had placed a stop payment order on the check. I calmly told him that I had reconsidered my gift and realized that since he had enough money for his vacation, he no longer needed it. He told me that it was his money now and that he had already made reservations. I kept my voice steady, drawing on decades of professional composure, and reminded him that I had earned that money through 40 years of careful work and sacrifice. I told him that it had become his only through my generosity, a generosity he clearly didn't appreciate. He told me that I couldn't do this, that Ashley had already bought clothes and that they had booked everything. I told him that I was sure someone as resourceful as his wife could find a solution. My son's voice rose with indignation, accusing me of being petty and vindictive. I calmly corrected him, explaining that I was being deliberate. I simply wanted to honor the boundary he had established yesterday when he made it clear that elderly people like me should stay behind if we couldn't afford their lifestyle. The line went quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his tone held a threat I had never heard before. He said that if that was my choice, I shouldn't expect them to visit anymore or call me for the holidays. He told me that I had chosen my path. I told him that I understood. As I looked at Margaret's photograph, I remembered her last request about guiding him. I told him that I supposed this was his way of showing gratitude for the 5 years of support I had given him since his mother's death. He hung up without another word. I sat in my small office, surrounded by memories of better times and the evidence of years spent helping an ungrateful child. I made a notation in my appointment book for the next morning. It was clear that my son had forgotten the value of respect, sacrifice, and loyalty. Perhaps it was time for a more comprehensive education. I can only imagine how Ashley must have been checking her makeup in the rearview mirror as Michael drove through my neighborhood, gripping the steering wheel like he was going into battle. I'm sure they had spent the entire morning strategizing, thinking that if they came over at dinner time, I would be the most vulnerable to their emotional assault. I could hear Ashley telling him to make me feel guilty about breaking up the family, since I was all alone after his mother's death. I'm certain Michael's jaw was tight as he told her he couldn't believe I was putting them through this over some hurt feelings. Ashley, of course, would have corrected him, telling him that it wasn't about hurt feelings, it was about power. She would have told him that I thought I could control them with money, but they were going to show me that wasn't the case. They would have parked behind my car and marched to my front door like an execution squad. I'm sure Michael didn't even knock and just walked right into my kitchen, where I was calmly plating my salmon and vegetables. Ashley would have immediately announced that we needed to talk, holding her purse like a weapon. I would have calmly looked up from my dinner, unsurprised by their entrance. Michael's face would have already been flushed with indignation, telling me to stop with the polite act and that I knew exactly why they were there. I'm sure Ashley would have positioned herself between me and the living room, searching for any sign of weakness. I imagine her trying to make me feel bad, telling me that family supports each other and doesn't play cruel games. I would have put down my fork and thoughtfully repeated the word family. I would have told them that was an interesting concept coming from someone who had just called me elderly and complained about having to drag me along on their vacation. I'm sure her voice would have cracked slightly as she tried to tell me that it was taken out of context and that they were just stressed about money. Michael would have stepped forward, trying to intimidate me, telling me that I couldn't just change my mind and that they needed that money because they had made commitments based on my promise. I would have calmly asked him about my feelings and reminded him that he had told me to stay behind if I couldn't afford a ticket. I stood up slowly, my composure never wavering. It wasn't about feelings, I said. It was about character. Ashley tried to use Margaret's memory against me, suggesting that my wife would want us to work through this as a family. That was their mistake. I told them not to dare invoke her memory to justify their greed. Margaret had taught Michael about gratitude and loyalty, values that Ashley had clearly helped him forget. Michael's face grew red with anger as he said that I was being completely unreasonable and that the money had been promised to them. I asked when I had ever promised them $50,000. I reminded him that it was a gift, and a gift could be reconsidered when the recipients proved themselves unworthy. Ashley then tried one final manipulation, saying that she was sorry she had hurt my feelings and that Michael was sorry, too. She asked if we could resolve the issue like adults and restore the check. The single word, no, hung in the air, a final and definitive answer. They both stared at me in shock, having clearly expected their emotional blackmail to work. Michael's voice became threatening as he told me that I would never see them again, no phone calls, no visits, and no grandchildren. He said that I was choosing money over family and that I would have to live with that choice. I looked at my son, who seemed like a stranger to me, and felt only sadness. I told him that if that was his choice, I would respect it, but that I would not be blackmailed into funding their lifestyle. They stormed out, and I watched through the window as they argued in their car before driving away. I returned to my cooling dinner and opened my address book to the page for a local travel agency. Tomorrow morning would bring new opportunities to teach them about consequences. 3 days later, the rain had stopped, and the perfect California sunshine was encouraging my tomato plants to grow. I was tending to my garden, something that always brought me a sense of peace. I enjoyed watching things grow, knowing that patience and proper care always yielded results. My neighbor, Dorothy, came over to our shared fence, a coffee mug in her hand. She complimented me on my garden, and I thanked her, brushing the soil from my hands. We bonded over our shared widowhood and our love for our quiet neighborhood. Dorothy casually mentioned that she had seen my son at the travel agency yesterday, booking a very elaborate Hawaii package. I kept my expression neutral and asked her what she had heard. She said he had booked a presidential suite for 14 nights, as well as a helicopter tour, private beach cabanas, and spa packages. Dorothy laughed with disbelief, as the entire trip was more than most people spent on a car. I calculated that even without my $50,000, they were still planning to go on a vacation that would cost them roughly $41,000, money that they clearly didn't have. I asked her when they were leaving, and she said it was from May 5th to the 19th. Ashley had been very specific about the dates because it had to coincide with a social media campaign she was planning. Dorothy then lowered her voice and said that she hoped my son could afford it, since those resort bills had to be paid whether the guests could or not. After Dorothy went back inside, I sat on my back porch and made some careful notes. It was clear that Michael and Ashley were proceeding with their extravagant plans despite losing my financial support. This meant they were either going deeper into debt or had found another source of funds. Either way, they still hadn't learned their lesson. I went inside and called a familiar number for Pacific Airlines customer relations. I spoke to James Wilson, a man who had moved to airline management 5 years ago, but we had maintained a good professional relationship from my banking days. He seemed happy to hear from me and asked if I was enjoying my retirement. I explained that I was calling about a small favor. I told him that my son and daughter-in-law were flying to Hawaii on May 5th and that I was concerned they were overextending themselves financially. James understood immediately and shifted his tone. I asked if there was a possibility that their flight could experience some minor technical difficulties. I was only looking for enough of a delay for them to reconsider their financial priorities. He chuckled and said that they had been experiencing some ongoing maintenance issues with that route and that computer glitches sometimes took 6 or 8 hours to resolve properly, of course, with safety as their top priority. I told him that I appreciated his attention to passenger safety, and we ended the call. After I hung up, I made another notation in my book and picked up my phone to look up Ashley's social media. Her accounts were set to public, which revealed more about their financial situation than they probably realized. Her Instagram had dozens of posts about their upcoming dream vacation with boastful captions about living their best life. She had promised her followers daily updates from their premium suite, pictures from the helicopter tour, and a spa day reveal. She had created an enormous amount of social pressure for herself. If she cancelled, it would be more than just financial embarrassment, it would be public humiliation. I scrolled through her recent posts, taking careful screenshots. I noticed that her responses to questions about how they could afford such a trip were becoming increasingly defensive. It was clear she was already feeling the scrutiny of her social circle. I closed the laptop and made one last note in my calendar. I knew May 5th was still 2 weeks away, which was plenty of time for their financial stress to build. Margaret had always said that the best gardens required both careful planning and patient tending. This particular crop was going to need more cultivation before it was ready for harvest. By the end of the final week, Michael's laptop screen was filled with the harsh reality of financial rejection. Every application he submitted had been denied. His credit score had plummeted after multiple inquiries, and each rejection felt like another door slamming shut. Ashley sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by jewelry boxes. She reluctantly added her wedding ring to the pile. Her plan was to take it to the pawn shop and try to get some money. 3 days later, she came home with only $800 and red-rimmed eyes. The jewelry that had cost Michael $3,000 was dismissed by the broker as decent quality, but that the market was soft right now. Michael suggested they only go for 5 days instead of 14. They had been having this same conversation for days, and each time, it felt more desperate than the last. Ashley's phone buzzed with another Instagram comment, telling her that she was living her best life and that they couldn't wait to see her pictures from Hawaii. She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the reply button. How could she tell them that their best life was currently worth exactly $3,200 in cash and 3 maxed-out credit cards? She told Michael that they couldn't back down now. She had already posted the countdown timer, and everyone at her job knew about the trip. If they cancelled, they would look like complete failures. Michael told her that it was insane to go into serious debt for appearances. Ashley's voice cracked with frustration as she told him that this was all his fault, that he knew exactly what he was doing with that check. Friday morning brought another loan rejection. Even a predatory lending company had turned them down. Michael's boss politely declined his request for a salary advance, and Ashley's sister responded to their desperate text message with 3 crying face emojis. Their last hope for a loan would take a week to process, and they were leaving in 2 days. Ashley told him, in an eerily calm voice, that they only had $3,000. She said that was all that 5 years of marriage and 2 college degrees had gotten them. Michael watched her fingers shake as she calculated their minimum payments, resort costs, and meal expenses. Their Hawaiian dream had turned into a nightmarish budget breakdown. They could only afford 3 nights at the cheapest hotel, with no helicopter tours, spa treatments, or romantic dinners. Ashley told him with forced brightness that at least they could take some nice photos. She said no one needed to know which hotel they were staying at, they could just take pictures in the lobby of the Grand WA, pretending they belonged there. The lies they were planning felt heavier than their luggage. That night, Michael lay awake listening to Ashley practice her excited voice for the selfies she planned to take at the airport. Through their thin apartment walls, he could hear their neighbor's television playing a financial advice program about the importance of living within your means. Sunday morning, Ashley's phone buzzed with a text message that made Michael's stomach drop. The message was from Thomas, my former junior analyst, letting him know that their final loan application had been denied. It was then that Michael slowly began to realize that I wasn't just withholding help, I was actively monitoring their financial desperation. The quiet man who had raised him had somehow orchestrated their systematic humiliation. As Ashley applied her makeup with trembling hands, preparing for their departure in 12 hours, Michael finally understood that they were walking into a trap I had spent weeks carefully constructing. The suitcase lay open on their bed, a mockery of their deferred dreams, filled with designer clothes Ashley had carefully selected for social media. She held up a white sundress, checking herself in the mirror one last time. She whispered that it would photograph beautifully against the ocean, even though their budget hotel was 6 blocks from the beach. Michael sat at their kitchen table, counting their cash for the 11th time. They had $3,200 in cash and 3 credit cards with a combined available balance of $800. Their entire financial future had been reduced to a pile of cash and maxed-out plastic. Ashley continued with forced optimism, telling him that the plan would work if they were careful. She said she could stretch the content for 2 weeks if she was smart about it. Her phone lit up with another comment on her last post, telling her they were so jealous and couldn't wait to see all of her pictures. At 5:30 a.m., their Uber arrived, carrying them toward what felt like a financial funeral. Ashley clutched her phone, frantically checking the weather and planning her first poolside selfie, while Michael stared out the window, wondering how they had gotten to this point. The San Diego International Airport was full of early morning energy. Michael and Ashley joined the check-in line for Pacific Airlines Flight 447, scheduled to depart at 8 a.m. sharp. After providing their names and confirmation number, they received their boarding passes. For a moment, Michael felt a flutter of genuine excitement. They were actually going to Hawaii. Then, a death sentence was announced over the speakers. Attention passengers on Pacific Airlines Flight 447 to Honolulu. Due to unexpected technical difficulties, this flight has been delayed indefinitely. Ashley's face went white. She asked what they had said. Michael was already walking toward the gate counter, where the agent was repeating the news. The agent, looking apologetic, said they were looking at a minimum of a 6-hour delay, possibly longer. Ashley's voice cracked as she mentioned her reservations, dinner plans, and scheduled posts. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was the complete collapse of their carefully constructed lie. Ashley sank into an airport chair, her designer purse sliding to the floor. She stared at her phone screen, where her departure post had already received 43 likes and 12 comments. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, paralyzed by the impossibility of explanation. Michael suggested they could rebook for tomorrow, even though they both knew their hotel reservations were non-refundable and they couldn't afford an extra night. Ashley looked up at him with eyes that had begun to understand the full scope of their trap. She told him that they had enough money for exactly 3 days, and one extra night would kill their entire budget. As they sat surrounded by their luggage, watching other passengers make alternative arrangements they couldn't afford, Ashley finally began to suspect what Michael was starting to realize. This delay wasn't a random mechanical failure. It was the final move in a chess game their father had been playing. The airport departure board mocked them. Ashley stared at the words, Flight 447 delayed, while scrolling through comments from friends who expected her to be sipping a Mai Tai by sunset. For the first time, she wondered if they had seriously underestimated me. 24 hours after their airport humiliation, Michael's laptop screen cast a harsh blue light across his face. He had spent most of the day researching Pacific Airlines and their recent delays, but he couldn't find any. He looked over at Ashley, who was curled up on the couch like a wounded animal, trying to salvage her social media image. He told her to look at his screen and that no other Pacific Airlines flights had been delayed yesterday. She barely glanced up from her phone, telling him he was being paranoid. He then showed her the complete delay history, proving that every other carrier had normal operations and that their single flight to Honolulu had been surgically delayed while everything else operated normally. He said with quiet certainty that I had done this. Ashley finally looked up, her makeup smeared from crying. She said that was impossible, that I was a retired bank employee, not some airline executive, and that he was giving me way too much credit. Michael opened a new browser tab and searched for Pacific Airlines Management. He found the name James Wilson, Director of Operations. He knew the name but couldn't place it. Ashley dismissed his search as chasing ghosts, saying that even if I knew someone at the airline, they wouldn't risk their job for a personal vendetta. But Michael was already searching his memory, recalling the worn leather address book that sat on my desk, filled with names and relationships from my banking career. The professional network, he whispered, as the pieces clicked into place. I had spent 30 years building relationships with people across every industry. I had helped finance their businesses and their dreams. Ashley's phone buzzed with another comment, asking where the Hawaii beach pictures were. She showed him the screen, saying that Sarah from work was asking where the photos were. She had told everyone that she would be posting daily updates. Ashley's laugh held no humor. She told him that everyone knew something was wrong. Michael watched his wife, a woman he had married 5 years ago, crumble under the weight of her own lies. The countdown posts, the promise of daily updates, and the bragging about their expensive vacation had created a public commitment she couldn't escape. They needed to tell people something, she said, desperately. I could say we got food poisoning or that you had a work emergency. Or we could tell the truth. Ashley stared at him like he'd suggested they set themselves on fire. The truth? That we couldn't afford the vacation we've been bragging about for weeks? That your father canceled his financial support because we were rude to him, that we're broke and humiliated, and everyone was right to question how we could afford Hawaii in the first place. Michael looked at his laptop screen where Pacific Airlines' perfect on-time performance record glowed like an accusation. His father had somehow orchestrated not just the cancelled check, but their complete social and financial humiliation. The quiet man who'd raised him had been playing chess while they stumbled through checkers. "We have to face him," Michael said finally. "I need to know how he did this." Ashley shook her head frantically. "What if you're wrong? What if we go over there making crazy accusations and just humiliate ourselves further?" "I'm not wrong." Michael closed the laptop with firm conviction. "And if I am, we demand he fix this mess. Either way, we're going to see Dad." Ashley looked at her phone one more time where 3 more comments asked about their Hawaii adventure. Her followers were beginning to suspect something was wrong and her deflection attempts were becoming increasingly transparent. "Fine," she said quietly. "But if we're doing this, I'm not going in there looking defeated." She disappeared into their bedroom to repair her makeup and choose clothes that projected success rather than desperation. Michael sat alone with the laptop, staring at the search results that had revealed his father's invisible hand in their disaster. For the first time in his adult life, he felt something approaching respect for Robert Harrison's strategic capabilities. And that realization terrified him more than their financial crisis. His phone buzzed with a text from his boss. "Hope you're having a great time in Hawaii. Looking forward to hearing about your vacation when you get back." Michael stared at the message, understanding fully that they were trapped in a web of lies with no clean way out. Whatever happened next, they were walking into their father's carefully constructed lesson with no leverage and no escape plan. The drive to Robert's house loomed ahead like a march toward inevitable defeat. The doorbell's familiar chime echoed through my house at exactly 6 o'clock, and I smiled slightly as I set down my gardening book. Punctuality had always been Michael's way of asserting control, even when he had none left to assert. "Dad, we need to talk." Michael stood in my doorway, keys still clutched in his white-knuckled fist, trying to project authority he no longer possessed. "Of course, please come in." I stepped aside, noting Ashley's carefully applied makeup that couldn't quite hide the puffiness around her eyes. "Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot." "We're not here for social visits," Ashley said sharply, though she followed Michael into my living room where I'd been reading peacefully in my favorite armchair. "I see." I settled back into my chair, maintaining the relaxed posture of someone who held all the cards. "What can I help you with?" Michael remained standing, pacing slightly, a nervous habit I remembered from his childhood when he'd been caught in mischief. "You arranged for our flight to be delayed." "That's an interesting theory." I folded my hands calmly. "Do you have any evidence to support such a claim?" "No other Pacific Airlines flights were delayed yesterday," Michael said, his voice gaining confidence as he presented his research. "I checked every route, every departure time. Our flight was the only technical failure in their entire system." "Airlines do experience isolated mechanical issues," I replied mildly. "That's why they prioritize safety over schedules." Ashley stepped forward, her manipulation tactics shifting into gear. "Even if that's true, we're your family. We're struggling and you're just watching us fall apart. This isn't what loving fathers do to their children." I looked at her with the same calm expression I'd maintained throughout their visit. "Ashley, remind me, what exactly did you say about elderly people who can't afford $1,400 tickets?" Her face flushed. "That was, we were stressed about money. And you said you weren't dragging elderly people along who would complain about everything." I kept my voice level, factual. "Those were your exact words." Michael stopped pacing. "Dad, we may have said things we didn't mean, but Michael," I interrupted gently. "Do you remember James Wilson? He worked with me on the commercial lending team when you were in high school. Nice fellow, very professional. He moved to airline management about 5 years ago." The color drained from Michael's face as the name clicked into place. He'd met James at several company barbecues, remembered him as the young analyst who'd always treated me with obvious respect and gratitude. When you help people achieve their professional goals, I continued conversationally. They tend to remember, James has done very well at Pacific Airlines, customer relations director now, I believe. Ashley looked between us frantically. You can't be serious. You asked someone to sabotage our flight. Sabotage? I raised an eyebrow. That's a strong word. I simply mentioned that my son and daughter-in-law were taking a trip they couldn't afford and that perhaps a brief delay might give them time to reconsider their financial priorities. James agreed that safety should always come first. Michael sank into my couch, his legs suddenly unsteady. You've been planning this since the restaurant. I've been reacting to your choices, I corrected. When you decided that my money came with disrespect, I decided to stop providing it. When you proceeded with plans despite losing my support, consequences followed naturally. Ashley tried one final desperate manipulation. Your wife, Michael's mother, would be heartbroken to see you treating us this way. She'd want you to forgive us and help us. I stood slowly, my calm finally giving way to something sharper. Don't you dare invoke Margaret's memory again. My wife taught me that love requires boundaries, that helping people means holding them accountable for their choices. She would understand exactly what I'm doing, which is what exactly. Michael's voice carried exhausted defeat. Teaching you that actions have consequences, that respect is earned, not demanded, that family relationships work both ways. I moved to my bookshelf and pulled out a folder I'd prepared for this moment. That sometimes the people you dismiss as elderly have resources you never imagined. I opened the folder and pulled out a printed confirmation page, handing it to Michael. His eyes widened as he read the details. Robert Harrison, Presidential Suite at the Maui Grand Resort. Departure May 7th. Return June 7th. A full month at the very resort they couldn't afford in the exact accommodations they dreamed of booking. Thank you for reminding me about Hawaii, I said quietly. Margaret and I always planned to take that dream vacation, but we never had the chance. Your behavior helped me realize it was time to honor her memory properly. Ashley stared at the confirmation like it was written in a foreign language. You're going on our vacation. I'm going on the vacation I can afford to honor the wife who sacrificed everything for our family. I took the paperback and returned it to the folder. The vacation I'm taking with money I earned through 40 years of careful work, not money I demanded from relatives I'd insulted. Michael's shoulders sagged as the full scope of his defeat became clear. What do you want from us, Dad? I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and enabled for far too long, and felt something that might have been hope. I want you to understand what you've lost, I said simply. And decide whether you want to earn it back. The silence stretched between us like a bridge neither of them seemed ready to cross. Outside the evening light was fading, and tomorrow I would begin the vacation that should have been Margaret's gift to herself. But tonight, I had finally taught my son that love without respect is just expensive enabling, and that sometimes the best gift you can give someone is the chance to discover their own strength through facing their own consequences. Dawn crept through my bedroom curtains as I folded the Hawaiian shirt Margaret had bought me 3 years ago, bright blue with white hibiscus flowers, still bearing the tags from when I'd insisted we couldn't afford a vacation. Now it lay carefully in my suitcase beside resort, casual clothes I'd never thought I'd wear. The weather app showed Maui at 82 degrees and sunny. Perfect. My boarding pass sat on the nightstand. Flight 892, Seat 2A, departing 10:00 UAM, but first class. Something Michael and Ashley had never even considered when planning their fantasy trip. Coffee steamed in my favorite mug as I checked my email one last time. The resort confirmation glowed on my laptop screen. Presidential Suite, 30 nights, ocean view, private beach access, everything they dreamed of but couldn't afford. Meanwhile, across town, Michael sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by bills and rejection letters. I could picture him there, laptop open, calculator nearby, finally understanding what they had lost. The night to think had changed something in his expression when they had left yesterday evening. For the first time, he'd looked genuinely ashamed rather than just angry. My phone buzzed with a text from Dorothy next door. Saw your luggage by the door. Have a wonderful trip. You've earned this vacation. Thank you, I texted back. Margaret would have loved to see this. The Uber arrived at 9:15 and I took one last look at the house that had sheltered me through retirement, widowhood, and the painful lesson I just taught my son. Family photos lined the hallway. Michael's graduation, his wedding, happier times when respect flowed both ways. At the airport, check-in moved smoothly. The first-class counter agent smiled warmly when she saw my confirmation. Presidential suite in Maui, Mr. Harrison. How wonderful. Is this a special occasion? Honeymoon, I said quietly. 40 years late, but better than never. Security waved me through the shorter line, and the first-class lounge welcomed me with comfortable chairs and complimentary breakfast. Other travelers complained about delayed flights and lost luggage while I sat peacefully reading about Hawaiian history and sipping fresh orange juice. At 9:45, my boarding zone was called. I gathered my carry-on and walked toward the gate, passport and boarding pass in hand. Around me, families hugged goodbye. Business travelers made last-minute calls. Couples took selfies before their adventures. Then I saw him. Michael stood at the security checkpoint, arguing with a TSA agent, his face flushed and desperate. He was holding what looked like a hastily purchased ticket, gesturing frantically toward my gate. Even from a distance, I could see the panic in his movements. The same anxiety he'd shown as a child when caught in serious trouble. Something had changed. This wasn't the entitled young man who'd threatened me yesterday evening. This was someone who'd spent a sleepless night confronting uncomfortable truths about himself. I paused near the boarding area, watching him navigate airport bureaucracy with growing desperation. The departure board showed my flight in final boarding status. In 15 minutes, I'd be airborne, heading toward the vacation Margaret and I had always promised ourselves. But Michael was running toward something, too. Not Hawaii, not money, not manipulation. He was running toward an apology that might actually mean something. The gate agent made the final boarding announcement. Last call for Flight 892 to Honolulu. All remaining passengers should board immediately. I watched my son clear security and sprint toward my gate. His face showing emotions I hadn't seen since he was small. Genuine remorse, desperate hope, the vulnerability of someone who'd finally understood what he'd lost. For the first time in months, Michael looked like the son I'd raised rather than the stranger he'd become. And despite everything, despite the pain and disappointment and carefully orchestrated lessons, I felt something I'd almost forgotten. I felt like his father again. Sir, you can't enter the gate area without a boarding pass for today's flights, the TSA agent explained patiently to Michael, who stood breathless and disheveled at the security checkpoint. Please, Michael gasped, holding up a refundable ticket he'd bought online during his frantic drive to the airport. I need to reach my father before his flight leaves, Flight 892 to Honolulu. The agent's expression softened at the desperation in Michael's voice. Let me call ahead to the gate. What's your father's name? Robert Harrison. He's in first class. Seat 2A. I need to apologize to him before it's too late. 20 minutes later, Michael burst through the first-class lounge doors, scanning faces until he found me sitting calmly by the window, reading my book about Hawaiian culture. I looked up as he approached, noting his rumpled clothes and the raw honesty in his eyes. What are you doing here, Michael? I came to say I'm sorry. The words tumbled out without preamble or strategy. Really sorry. Not because I want anything, but because I finally understand what we did to you. I sat down my book, studying his face for signs of manipulation. Understand what exactly? That we forgot you were our father, not our bank account. Michael's voice cracked slightly. Yesterday, you asked what we wanted from you and Ashley demanded you restore the check. But sitting in that restaurant 3 weeks ago when you offered to join our vacation, all you wanted was to spend time with your family. The boarding announcement crackled through the lounge. Final boarding call for Flight 892 to Honolulu. All passengers should be at the gate immediately. I have to go, I said, standing and gathering my carry-on. I know. Michael stepped back, making no move to block my path. I just wanted you to know that I remember now. After Mom died, you worked double shifts at the bank so I could stay in school. You sold the house in La Jolla, your dream house, to pay for her treatments. You gave me $45,000 for college when I kept changing majors. And you never once made me feel guilty about it. I stopped walking. In all our conversations about money over the years, Michael had never acknowledged understanding the scope of my sacrifices. When Ashley said those things about elderly people, I should have defended you, he continued. When we demanded that $50,000 like it was owed to us, I should have remembered that everything you gave came from love, not obligation. What do you want from me, Michael? I asked, using the same question that had ended our confrontation yesterday. Nothing, he said immediately. I don't deserve your help anymore. Ashley and I will figure out our finances ourselves. I'm looking for a second job. Maybe delivering food on weekends will make it work without depending on you. For the first time in years, my son sounded like a responsible adult rather than an entitled child. That's the son I raised, I said quietly. The gate agent appeared in the lounge doorway. Mr. Harrison, we need to board you immediately or hold the aircraft. I looked at Michael, this man who'd finally found his way back to the values Margaret and I had tried to teach him. Walk me to the gate. As we made our way through the terminal, Michael told me about his plan to tackle their debt systematically, to return to the financial discipline he'd abandoned somewhere along the way. He talked about maybe taking evening classes to improve his skills, about Ashley finally understanding that social media likes weren't worth destroying family relationships. At the gate, I handed my boarding pass to the agent, then turned back to Michael. When I return in a month, maybe we can have dinner, I said. But this time, you choose the restaurant. Something within your budget. Michael's smile was the first genuine one I'd seen from him in years. I'd like that, Dad. I'd really like that. I walked down the jet bridge toward my long-delayed dream vacation, feeling not just the satisfaction of justice served, but the deeper joy of a father who had successfully taught his son what really mattered. Behind me, Michael stood at the gate window, no longer angry or desperate, but hopeful. As the plane taxied away from the terminal, my phone buzzed with a text from my son. Thank you for not giving up on me. See you in June. Love you, Dad. Margaret had been right about so many things, but especially this. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is let them face the consequences of their choices. And sometimes if you're patient and firm and refuse to enable their worst impulses, they'll find their way back to being the person you always knew they could be. The plane lifted off toward Hawaii, carrying me toward the vacation Margaret and I had always planned. But more importantly, it was leaving behind a son who had finally learned that family relationships aren't built on financial transactions. They're built on love, respect, and the willingness to do better when you've done wrong. 30,000 feet above the Pacific, I opened my book about Hawaiian history and smiled. Paradise was waiting, but the real victory was already won. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.